This is Law with Charlie, hosted by Charlie Medcalf. This is your podcast and YouTube channel for all things law, legal academia, and qualifying as a barrister.
Hello and welcome to this latest podcast about the juries and all of that good stuff. So this is part of the Save Our Juries system, and this is really part 2 of my last episode. So in my last episode you may recall that I was actually looking at my day in court, and in that particular case, that particular court, I spent a total of 3 days watching that case. And there was an interesting outcome in terms of the jury going out, and they were back in about, I think it was 2 to 3 hours. I'm just checking my notes now because I did write it down. The jury took 3 hours 16 minutes in their deliberations, and I was so annoyed that I missed legal directions because that was the day I was in my mini pupillage. But yes, whilst I was sat in the courtroom waiting for the jury to return, and I'm so happy they returned when I was there, I was on my notebook, my Remarkable 2, and I was really considering, in terms of the jury problems, getting rid of juries, the main reason they've given us for getting rid of juries is to save time, because of the horrendous time delays. And so, whilst I was in court, I was making notes of everything I could think of for my few days in court that contributed to delays in the trial. Bearing in mind that, I'm sure I said it in my last episode, the judge was very, very keen to get this trial done very swiftly and promptly, which was really, really good to see. But despite that, there were still problems, and as I've said throughout this podcast series, it wasn't really because of the juries. It was pretty much everyone else other than the juries, and so that's very much what I'm going to be discussing in this episode. So I'm going to start by acknowledging the one area where juries did delay the trial, and that is their deliberations. But that's not criticism. It goes to show how these juries, they examine all the evidence and they do their very hardest to reach what's a fair, just outcome for everyone involved in the case. In this case, the jury, I was quite surprised with their verdict, but I think it's the verdict I would have gone with. They came back with not guilty. And before I go further into this episode, it's very important that I remind you, we do not know why the jury came back with a not guilty verdict. We will never know. We're not allowed to know. Contempt of court, jury, messing with the jury, whatnot. It's a criminal offence to ask a juror what went on in their deliberations, and so I cannot comment about what they may have discussed or why they came to the conclusion they did. And my opinion is basically just my opinion. Unlike the jury, I wasn't there for all of the case, sadly. And I suppose for me, there was some reasonable doubt. Or in other words, I wasn't sure that the defendant did commit the crimes he was accused with, sentenced with. But anyway, I digress. Imagine that. But yes, so the only problem I really realised with the jury was their deliberations, 3 hours 16 minutes. Although, and this is something I can only praise and compliment the court and the judge for, whilst the jury were out for at least part of the time, they were hearing other cases. Not all the cases I was able to sit through, but they got through quite a few. They were mainly preliminary matters, bail variations, which I wasn't allowed in, and then there was also a sentencing hearing, which was incredibly upsetting to watch, with it being just before Christmas as well. but the court were making good use of their time. However, when it got to the afternoon, the court I was in did seem to have run out of time not ran out of time, sorry, ran out of cases, and so there was a large proportion of the afternoon where myself and the other individuals in the courtroom were just sat there, twiddling our thumbs and waiting for the jury to come back. And he did come back, as I've already mentioned. And also, as I mentioned, whilst I was waiting, I made notes of where it's gone wrong and why. And so I've wasted quite a lot of time, but now is the time where I go into my observations. And so you will hear me say this time and time again, it's really not the jury, it's everyone else. And in the case I saw, one of the main things causing time delays was the prosecution. Now, I'm not criticising the prosecutor. They had a difficult job satisfying quite a scary judge, to be honest. And they have so much on their plates. But the prosecution, throughout this case, often didn't have the evidence ready, nor did they have the witnesses ready. And there's a variety of reasons for this. So, firstly, the criminal justice system in general, there's general delay and budget cuts. Criminal justice system and the CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, are massively underfunded, and that puts constraints on the system, and that's what makes the system fail. That's what causes the delays. I've heard various things about courts being closed for days and whatnot, and I think that happened in this case because we weren't sitting on Wednesday, and when I looked on the court listings, the court I was in, they were nowhere to be seen on the listings. But you can hardly blame the jury for that. And yeah, the poor prosecutor was running around all over the place, up and down the court building. And it's not all their problem, it's the police not doing their job or having to wait for them or whatnot. Another problem is when the witnesses don't show up on time, if they show up at all. And that was something which was brought up in the case I was observing. Two of the witnesses, key witnesses, did not show up. The prosecution had lost track of them. They went missing, essentially. And so the judge had to issue the warrant for their arrest to compel them to come to court. And from what I've heard, they weren't overly happy, but they did get to court and they did give evidence. But that process delayed the trial because we had to wait for them to be arrested, and then it was essentially the next court day before they actually showed up. And so all of that causes delay as well, and that's not as such a prosecution problem, but because of the way the system works, it comes down to the prosecution because it's their witnesses, and so they should make sure their witnesses are there and ready on time. Then this comes on to my next problem, how the case was halted and the court was at standstill when prosecution witnesses or evidence were not ready to be examined or whatnot. And one of the key examples in the case I watched were the police. It sounds like they had a police common room, or a police room essentially, and that was downstairs of my courtroom, the courtroom I was in. And one of the days there was an afternoon where it was a lot of police officers, but we were having to wait for them all to get to the court and all that. And the judge asked for these witnesses to be lined up outside the court ready to give evidence, but sadly they were not. And so things like this also delay the trial, and that's very much a problem with the personnel in the system. You provide them special facilities and all that, they're going to make the most of them, and there's not the people available, especially for the prosecution, to make sure the witnesses are where they need to be in good time. So, yeah, and I've already mentioned briefly how evidence not being readily prepared and ready. For instance, I got lucky and I was able to listen to a hearsay application. But at the time where we first heard this application, the prosecution didn't have the evidence or the necessary documents ready for this bad character evidence. Sorry, it's not hearsay, it's bad character. There was also a hearsay application, which I missed, sadly. But yeah, bad character application, and thankfully it didn't stop the judge from making a ruling in that voir dire, as they're called, trial within a trial. But it's not very good, really. It's not very professional. And then the next one is a very common criticism. And this is a criticism which the Secret Barrister in their various books have mentioned quite a lot, actually. And this is the point of delays in transferring defendants and all witnesses who are arrested to court. That is because when these individuals are arrested, they don't make their own way to court. They're taken to court in essentially a van, bus, whatnot. They're transported by an external company to the courtroom, and it's often, well, I don't know how often it is really. I've only seen this once, but I've read a lot, and it seems to be common knowledge that these transporters are often late to court. And this was a problem in the trial I watched. The defendant got to court on time, which was absolutely amazing. However, the two witnesses who had to be arrested in order to get to court, they weren't at court when they needed to be at court. And so that also delayed the trial. And you'll notice again, not the jury, probably budget cuts, probably people not doing their job properly, although that might be a bit critical of me. But essentially, by messing with jury trials, getting rid of jury trials, you're really beating around the bush. Rather than trying to avoid the underlying problems, you need to be tackling them head on. Because if you do not tackle the underlying problems head on, they're still going to be around, and they're still going to have a negative impact on the trial process, the criminal justice system. And then that brings me on to my next point, where something I've already discussed really, and this is where I was writing the notes. The court was empty when waiting for the jury, and it wasn't even a Friday, it was a Thursday afternoon. And essentially, other matters could be heard during this time. More sentencing, bail applications, pleas, whatnot. There's various things which could have happened in this time. They could have even started the next trial or something. That's all something which could have happened. But no, the court was at a standstill. Now, it might be that it was at a standstill for a reason. For instance, the judge the judge was in his chambers, and maybe he had some work he needs to get done. Fair enough. Why not get another judge though, or even a district judge or whatnot, in the court instead? And essentially, I'm going to be touching on reform here, but I'm going to try and save the substance of my reform arguments for a later episode. But essentially, the courts shouldn't be left empty. If there's delays, which are causing serious problems, then we need to limit the time where the courts are left sat empty, because that is the main problem. There's more problem with the court being empty due to some of the circumstances I've discussed so far than it is for the jury. So, and on that note, yeah, the court's empty and the jury are being sent out to their room, jury common room and whatnot, waiting for something to happen. So, essentially, yeah, this is what I'm saying. Smaller, less important, or less time-consuming matters could still be handled in the court during this time, even if they were online and even if they were in front of a DJ, i.e., a district judge in some matters. And so that would be really expanding the district judge's role, because currently district judges only hear magistrates' court hearings on their own. But district judges, unlike magistrates, are legally qualified barristers most of the time, and so they could be given a bit more responsibility, and that would have many advantages, but I will get into more detail about this, as I say, in a later episode. Another problem is waiting for the counsel, i.e. the barristers or whatnot, or defendants to arrive in court. Now, when there's a trial underway and all that, it's not as much of a problem because the counsel and the defendants aren't a million miles away. I think it's mainly when it's a different trial case or whatnot, getting people to the same room and all that. And so, I'm not really sure how we would tackle this point, but that is something which I would imagine should be looked at, essentially. I've got a list now of reform suggestions, but I'm not going to go into that because, as I say, that's for another episode. But what I am going to do is go on to the next page of my notes, and essentially, I was posing the question to myself, and was then, after I posed the question, trying to find as many answers as possible. And the question was, why are they saying jurors are the problem? I'll repeat that so you can have a bit of reflection time. Why are they saying juries are the problem? Now, if you're anything like me, academic, like to have a think, I would recommend that you pause this podcast here and just have a think about it for yourself. Why do you think they are saying juries are the problem? But I'm going to go on to some of the reasons why I thought they were saying that. But before I do, I also noted how there's a number of problems with magistrates. But again, that's something for another day. And so, the first reason I thought was, this isn't necessarily why they are saying juries are the problem, but this is a problem I have with their suggestions. But by removing the jury from most cases, we are reducing the members of the public seeing or being involved in justice. Whenever I've been to court, there's not many people in the public gallery. It's mainly people associated with the defendant, occasionally witnesses or the press. In I think the majority of cases I've heard, I'm the only person who's truly a member of the public. But then again, you might see that as a bit different because I'm a law student and so I'm not strictly a member of the public. I'm training to be in that setting. And so, juries really allow the public to see justice being done and get inside a courtroom. I've previously been to court with both my mother and my grandmother, and they had never been in court before in their lives. And so, there's so many reasons why people might not go into court. One reason is they might not have the time, but also court can be a big scary place, and it's very unfamiliar for many people. But essentially, with the principle of open justice, justice shouldn't just be done, but it should be seen to be done, and that's why courtrooms have open doors in most cases, and why the public should be able to see it being done. And so, the juries is really a way to get people in the door, but also to allow the defendant to be judged by their own peers rather than people who are in the setting all the time. One of the problems, though, I think the main problem why they are saying juries are the problem is time and money. Yes, juries can take a bit more time than if we didn't have the juries. That's in deliberations, though, where they're consulting, evaluating the evidence. But does that mean if the juries are taking the time then, and we are saying that it would be quicker if we didn't have juries and the judge just made a decision, Does that mean the judge isn't looking at the factual evidence as thoroughly, as in depth as a jury, and maybe instead just focusing on the legal side of it, the matters of law, more so than the matters of fact? I'm not going to answer that, I'm just posing some suggestions here. Also, I was thinking that maybe another reason is because of the economy. These jurors have jobs, and when they are doing jury service, they are not being paid. They are not working, they are not being paid, they are not contributing to the economy. And although that's a bit beyond my expertise and I'm not sure how it quite links, I imagine, especially with the cost of living crisis and all of that financial stuff, that could be a bit of a problem. And I've already mentioned time and time again how time spent in jury deliberation, so I won't be going back into that. But also, requiring members of the jury to show up on time. Now, the jury I saw were, on the whole, rather good, but there will be times when juries are not showing up on time. I heard one story about a juror who was meant to be there, I think, at 10:30 at court, and showed up at about 12, for instance, because they overslept. And so you are putting a load of trust in the jury to get there on time, and so when they don't show up on time, that is going to cause delays. And yes, you can point a finger at them for that, but how often, how familiar is that occasion? How often are trials delayed because of the jury rather than everything else? I think some of the other issues I have discussed on this podcast happen more frequently than juries not showing up on time. And then another thing I was thinking about was reasonable doubt makes it harder to convict. And so, are juries more likely to have reasonable doubt? If so, could that encourage people to, encourage the government to get rid of juries in order to get more convictions? Because particularly for the CPS, which is a public department, governmental department, but it has been mentioned in the past how they're very much statistics based. They try and get as many convictions as possible. But the problem with this is, if we are trying to get as many convictions as possible, we have the prison overcrowding crisis. And also, the law is, in my opinion, unduly harsh in some areas. And so essentially, if we are going to find ways to keep convicting and increasing the number of convictions, and the majority of things we're convicting for are prison sentences, and we're running out of space in our prisons, what's going to happen then? Because I'm pretty sure that if we did get rid of juries, the conviction rate would most likely increase, and I would be very, very surprised if it didn't, to be honest. And then another thing I was thinking about is how there's not actually a lot of time in the court day. For instance, court days normally start up between 10 and half 10ish. They will have a lunch about 1 till 2, and then they will go on until about 4 to 5. And so, let me just think. That's about 6 hours, and a normal working day is 8 hours. And the judge in the case I was in made a good point. You are going to be focusing and concentrating much more than you ordinarily would whilst listening to all this evidence. So it makes sense, but ultimately, having shorter hours is going to lead to delay, because some of these trials need the time. But also, this is really, as I say, because of the effort, energy and concentration which is required. Jurors have travel arrangements as well, and maybe even childcare, and so maybe the whole idea of getting rid of jurors in most cases is to allow those individuals to contribute to the economy through employment, save them the travel, and also ensure that they can keep up with their childcare commitments. I also did do a bit of thinking about litigants in person, i.e. when individuals are self-representing, representing themselves, but that's not really something I need to discuss in this episode or in this series. But that does essentially bring me to the end of my notes, and so I think now is a good time to end this podcast, and hopefully I will be continuing this podcast and also uploading some other different kinds of podcasts very, very soon. And so before I go, if you are enjoying this podcast, please send me a comment in the comment section below. I love to hear from you, and it's always great to engage with the community. Please do rate and review this podcast, and please do follow so you will be notified when I upload my next podcasts. And just let me know, what do you think about this whole jury thing? Should juries be abolished in most cases, all cases, or should it just be left as it is? Don't fix something which isn't broken. Although the justice system is broken, I wouldn't say the jury system is particularly broken. And also, if you haven't already, do also check out my YouTube channel, Law with Charlie, as well. That's where I will post even more videos on all sorts of things. Public legal lectures, other lectures, general advice videos, and all sorts. And so yeah, please do take a look on there as well. But that ultimately concludes this episode, and I thank you all for listening, especially if you made it this far, and I look forward to speaking next time. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to Law with Charlie, with your host, Charlie Medcalf. Please do ensure that you leave a comment below, either to just say hello or ask a question. And please like, subscribe, and leave a review for more content like this. See you next time.